Welcome to this complete guide to mix vocals like a pro. Chris Elim here from Mixdown Online. Thank you for watching this video. This is going to be quite a ride. What I did for this one is I compiled a bunch of videos that I made over the past year and a half or so, where I talk about how to mix vocals with reverb, delay, saturation, compression, EQ, and so on. And this will give you all the tools you need to mix your vocals like a pro in one single video. On top of that, I'm giving you a bunch of mixing guides talking about delay, reverb, compression, EQ. You can download all of those PDF guides by clicking the link down below. Okay, now let's jump right in. It's going to be a long one, but it's fully worth it. Enjoy the ride. Okay, now let's jump and talk about vocal reverb. We add reverb on a vocal to add space, in our mixes, which makes sense. You don't want to end up with a super 100% dry vocal sound. So adding reverb is going to just help to add some space in the mix. But sometimes, a reverb can take a lot of room in the mix. And there's ways I'm going to share with you today to have way more control over your vocal reverb sound. So this way your vocal reverb is not going to overwhelm your mix. But remember that your vocal is the main event, and we're going to keep it this way. So let's jump in Cubase and listen to what we have. Okay, so this is the mix. It's a song from my good friend Josh Gilbert. The song is going to be released soon. So now I have that vocal reverb. That sounds good. Like for me, the tail of the reverb, the size of the reverb works for the verse, but it's a bit too overwhelming at its present form. So let's have a quick listen.
We had so much left to do together, but we won't get to it now. We knew it was coming.
Like I said, I love the size of the reverb. The tail is nice, but the reverb is way too much at the moment. So I'm going to fix a few things here. First of all, my number one tip, and this is something that I do, like I would say, for 98% of the time, every time I mix a vocal, the reverb I'm going to use for my lead vocal, I'm going to insert that reverb on a Knox channel or an effects channel track. So this way I keep my vocal in parallel from the dry vocal sound, okay, and not as an insert. Because you could, and a lot of people ask me the question, why don't you use your reverb as an insert on your vocal channel? And there are several reasons why I don't do so for 98% of the time, and one of these reasons is to have more control over my reverb. So this way I can craft my vocal reverb sound with way more flexibility. So I have those two channels separated. And this is something that I always advise people to do. Keep your reverbs on a separated effects channel. In my case, I use a stereo effects channel to do so, but this is a personal choice. It depends on the mix I'm working on. But for the most part, it's a stereo channel. And I'm sending as a send the signal from my vocal channel into this effects channel track where I have my reverb inserted. Next, and this is also something that I do a lot, is to EQ my reverb. Now, there's two ways you can EQ a reverb. You can EQ the incoming signal going into the reverb or the outcoming signal, the signal coming out of the reverb. Both will work well. And there's also, like on a lot of reverbs, you have access to an internal EQ, which is going to EQ the sound of the reverb, and on some other reverbs, you can EQ the incoming signal straight from the reverb itself, like we do in Cubase with the stock reverb plugin out of Cubase, which is RoomWorks. In this case, we have an input filters section where you can add a high-pass, low-pass filter on the incoming signal that goes into the reverb. In my case, on this reverb, I also have some parameters to tone shape the sound of the reverb, but this is not what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do here is to use an EQ plugin, a stock plugin out of Cubase, and I can insert that right before my reverb on the effects channel. And what I'm going to do here is the Abbey Road EQ trick, which is simply getting rid of low frequencies and top frequencies for the most part. And this is going to add more transparency to my reverb. Because with a reverb, especially on a vocal, we can end up with a lot of buildup when it comes to low frequencies and low mid frequencies. And this is what I'm going to, get more control over. So this way, my reverb doesn't take too much space, especially within those frequencies. And taming down those high frequencies also is going to help the reverb to sound a bit more natural, I would say, without hearing those high spikes, that we can end up with on a vocal sound. So what I have on this one is a high-pass filter that is going to just tame down everything under 500 hertz or so, and the same for my low-pass filter. Everything above 7K is also being tamed down. And on top of that, I'm adding a cut at around 2K. This is the mid-range, and those frequencies on some vocals can actually be aggressive, and I want to avoid my reverb sound to end up sounding a bit too edgy, So by taming that down, I'm adding a bit more transparency to the vocals. So let's have a listen to that EQ on the signal coming into the reverb.
I wasn't ready to lay you down. We had so much left to do together, but we won't get to it now. We knew.
It makes a huge difference. I can still hear my reverb. The tail is there, but I don't end up with a buildup on the low mids and low frequencies.
I wasn't ready to lay you down. We had so much left to do together, but we won't get to it now. We knew it was coming, just didn't know when. But you took your...
Okay, so that works very well. I can also, like I said, instead of EQing the incoming signal, I can add an EQ after my reverb.
I wasn't ready to lay you down. We had so much left to do.
So again, it's a personal choice. I tend to EQ the incoming signal most of the time because I like to keep my reverb as pure, I would say, as possible, and not try to tone shape too much the reverb itself, especially if it's the reverb sound that I like. But again, it's a case-by-case thing. Nothing stops me on doing it the other way around in some occasions. But, those are the two options you have. If you want to EQ your reverb, you can EQ the incoming signal or the reverb itself, meaning an EQ after the reverb or within the reverb if you have access to an EQ. And this is also something that I do on my end. Now, my next tip is to add distance to your reverb so you keep your vocal up front in your mix. So to do so, there's a couple of things we can do. Straight on the reverb, we have a parameter called pre-delay, okay? And this is a very important one. And this is going to help you to keep your vocal up front, dry. At least the attack of the vocal is going to stay dry and out of the reverb. And by adding pre-delay, that will delay the start of the reverb. So this way, like I said, the vocal is going to stay dry, the attack of the vocal is going to stay dry, and then the reverb will follow. So let's have a quick listen, and I'm going to overdo it so you can hear what it sounds like.
I wasn't ready to lay you down. We had so much left to do together, but we won't.
So if you notice, the minute I have way too much pre-delay, my reverb is starting to sound like a slapback delay because the pre-delay is too further away from the dry signal. So it's just a matter of balance and just to find the sweet spot so you keep your initial vocal attack dry and then you can hear the reverb.
I wasn't ready to lay you down.
So that works pretty well. Now on most reverbs, that pre-delay parameter is going to be calculated in milliseconds. Some will give you access to sync that value to the tempo of your project, but most of them won't. Okay, so you're going to need to calculate, if you want to just keep that in sync with the tempo of your project, you're just going to have to calculate the amount of milliseconds, like 1/16 of a note, which is the average, is going to give you in milliseconds according to the tempo of your project. Now, on my free PDF guide on vocal reverb, I have a formula that you can use to determine how much a 16th of a note or an eighth of a note and so on in milliseconds is according to the tempo of your project. So again, download this free guide. The link is down below. Now, in my case, if I want to, I can activate this little guy here, and that will make my pre-delay sync to a 16th of a note. That can work well. So that is something that you can do if you want to sync that to the tempo of your project. Something else you can also do to make your vocal upfront by keeping the tail size and sound of your reverb is to use sidechain compression on your reverb. So I have the reverb right here, and I have a compressor right after my reverb. And that compressor is going to be triggered by the incoming signal, which is the vocal. So for this to happen, you need to activate the sidechain on this compressor right here on top. In Cubase, you can actually set that up from the plugin itself. But if you don't have Cubase, by activating your sidechain on the plugin, that sidechain will be available on the send option you have here, and mine is right here. Okay, so I see at the bottom the sidechain, the reverb sidechain, which is the compressor right here. So I am sending my dry signal into the sidechain of this compressor. So every time the singer sings, it will trigger the compressor, and the compressor is going to react according to the threshold and all those parameters that I have. So I'm using a fast attack, a 3:1 ratio, and a sort of fast release. Also, this is something adjustable depending on the song I'm working on. And if we listen carefully, I'm going to overdo it so we can hear what that sounds like.
I wasn't ready to lay you down.
So as you can tell, every time I have some vocal, the compressor kicks in and the reverb is out of the way. And then the reverb comes back and I can keep my tail of the reverb that I like so much. But again, it's a matter of balance.
I wasn't ready to lay you down. We had so much left to do together, but we won't get to it now.
So that's pretty cool. So now I have like, maybe 4 or 5 dBs of gain reduction when the singer sings. And it helps me just to keep my vocal dry and upfront and keeping that reverb tail that sounds pretty good. So let's listen in the context of the mix.
So much left to do together, but we won't get to it now.
I love it, okay? I just love it. So you can hear that tail, that reverb tail, but my vocal stays right up front. Now for tip number 4, add some effects on the incoming signal feeding your reverb. So let's check it out. So there's some stuff that can also add a bit more to the distance feel of the reverb and make the reverb sound a bit more interesting. For example, adding a flanger on the incoming signal. So I'm going to activate this flanger, very simple one from Cubase, nothing fancy. Let's just monitor the signal coming from this effects channel. Okay, I'm just going to bypass the reverb. Okay, so that is the sound with the flanger that is going to feed my reverb. So let's add the reverb. Okay, now we're only hearing the reverb itself without the dry signal, so you can hear what kind of effect that sounds like. I'm going to remove it. That's pretty cool, so let's blend this with the rest.
I wasn't ready to lay you down. We had so much left to do together, but we won't get to it now.
It's pretty cool. You know, it adds a bit of color. Kind of like it. So this is something you can do. Nothing stops you on adding some saturation also. So let's activate the Decapitator and go crazy a bit. I'm not sure I'm going to like this one for this mix, but it is something that is pretty useful on other mixes.
I wasn't ready to lay you down. We had so much left to do together, but we won't.
Okay, so like for me, that's too much. But again, it's quite cool, you know, because the reverb itself with Decapitator or any type of saturation plugin can end up pretty interesting. No, and again, there's a lot going on here, but just a matter of balance. But that can be a good option as well, just to craft the tone of what's going into the reverb. Something else that I like to do is to add a compressor on the incoming signal that is feeding my reverb. And this is especially if I'm mixing a more dynamic vocal. Now, at the end of this verse, the vocal has way more energy going on. And by adding a compressor, it's just going to even out the dynamics, and I'm going to have way more control on the signal feeding my reverb. So let's have a listen.
But you took your last breath on earth, and now your true life begins.
Okay, let's add the compressor.
But you took your last breath on earth, and now your true life begins.
Okay, so that gives you an idea. But again, this is something that I do only if I'm dealing with a dynamic vocal that can be useful. Just to add a bit more control, dynamically speaking. So this way, you know, when you have like boost of energy or spikes and stuff, that can affect the sound of the reverb and just bring that reverb to spike up a bit, you know, especially on higher frequencies. And just by adding a compressor before it hits the reverb, it evens things out. So that is a very good option also. And for the last tip is to use automation on your vocal reverb. Now there are several ways you can do so, but adding automation is just going to make your mix sound more interesting. But again, it's a case-by-case thing. And on the mix that I'm working on right now, I do a form of automation because the verse vocal doesn't have the same amount of reverb compared to the chorus lead vocal. In this case, what can be done is to bring down and automate the level of the reverb straight on the channel itself between the verse and the choruses, because I'm relying a bit more on delays when it comes to the choruses compared to the verses where I use a bit more reverb than delays for this mix. So an option is to just automate the level of the effects channel track where I have my reverb inserted at. Or I can also just automate the incoming signal, you know, the send level signal going into the reverb channel. And that can be automated also. In my case, though, I have two channels for my lead vocal. One channel is for the verse and the other channel for the choruses. So I don't actually need to automate the send level or the reverb channel itself. I'm just sending different amount of signal from each of these channels. So the verse lead vocal channel is sending X amount of signal to the reverb channel. And on the chorus lead vocal channel, I'm sending like almost 50% less signal to the reverb channel. So this is a form of automation. So I don't have the same amount of reverb for the lead vocal coming out of the verse compared to the chorus. So let's have a quick listen.
But you took your last breath on earth, and now your true life begins. This will be the last time that we have to say goodbye, even though my heart...
So you get the idea. Automation is a very good tool to work with when it comes to vocal reverb. So there you go, my friends. Those are the 5 tips I wanted to share with you. Know that you don't have to use them all at once. That's not the goal of sharing those tips with you. My goal is to give you more tools in your mixing arsenal so you can make better decisions depending on the mix you are working on. Okay, now let's jump in Cubase and start talking about vocal compression. Okay, now this is an old project I worked on years ago by an artist called Peggy Polito from France. And let's have a quick listen to what we have.
Plus choisissons le plus beau chemin et avec lui ne faire aucun. La vie est reine, n'attendons plus que nous ayons disparu. Sortons des citadelles.
As you can tell, we have a more quieter verse compared to what we have on the chorus. And we have like dynamic peaks going on. And that's why we essentially work with compressors, is to just control the dynamic range of the signal. So this is basically what a compressor is going to do. It's basically going to be an automatic volume controller, okay? But it also plays with the sound envelope, which is going to affect the character of the vocal, and also the tone of the vocal depending on the compressor you work with. So those are different aspects of working with compression. But for the most part, what we need to do here is to add more control on the dynamics of the vocal. Now, the first thing that I do here when I mix a vocal is to use EQ and de-essing before working with a compressor. And what I do as far as the EQ goes, like you can see here, I do some correction EQ basically with some subtractive EQ that we call, which means that I'm just taming down all the problematic frequencies that I have on this vocal. And same for the de-esser. I have a de-esser which is going to control the S's of the vocals, and I don't want those problematic frequencies and S's to affect the compressor. So that's why I'm working that out before going into the first compressor. So that is the first trick, to use EQ correction and de-essing before compressing. Now for the next trick is to understand the attack and release parameter of a compressor. So let's add some compression on this vocal. I'm going to use just a stock plugin compressor from Cubase. The regular one, very simple, transparent, works very well. It's the perfect tool if you're starting to mix and you're new to compression. So this is the type of compressor you need to work with. All right, so now I'm going to bring back my threshold up. I have my ratio where I set that up to 4:1 ratio. And I have the attack time and release time right here, which I'm going to work with. Now, if we start with the attack time is going to be the amount of time it's going to take to the signal to get fully compressed once it reaches the threshold point. Okay, so once the signal gets below the threshold point, it's going to be the time it takes for the signal to be fully compressed. Okay, so that's why I'm repeating that twice, so you can understand it correctly. For the release time, it's the other way around. Once the signal goes above the threshold point, it's going to be the time for the compressor to stop compressing, basically. So this is what the release time goes, and it affects the character of the vocal. So we're going to check that out right away. So what I'm going to do for now is to bring that to a kind of a medium release time, and let's bring the attack time slower, and let's start compressing.
Plus choisissons le plus beau chemin et avec lui ne faire aucun. La vie est reine, n'attendons plus que nous ayons disparu.
Okay, now I'm going to solo this part, and I'm going to overdo it so we can actually hear what the compression is doing.
La vie est reine, n'attendons plus que nous ayons disparu.
Okay, now the attack time is pretty slow. I'm going to bring that down to 0.1 millisecond, very fast.
La vie est reine, n'attendons plus.
Okay, now the attack of that vocal is getting cut off. This is not what I want to do with this one.
La vie est reine, n'attendons plus.
So I'm going to bring my attack time slower. So 10 milliseconds or so is going to be a good start point.
La vie est reine, n'attendons plus.
Okay, now as far as the release goes, again, I'm overcompressing for now, so we can hear a difference. Now the release time, right now it's at 100 milliseconds. If I bring it slower,
La vie est reine, n'attendons plus que nous ayons disparu.
Okay, now the vocal takes way too much time to uncompress itself, so I'm getting a lot of compression. Okay, so this is not what I want. I want to keep that vocal a bit more up front. Now it sounds a bit further away because of the release time that is a bit too slow. So I'm going to bring that faster.
La vie est reine, n'attendons plus que nous ayons disparu.
Note that with a faster release, the vocal sounds way more upfront. I'm going to do this again, okay, by bringing the release time slower and then bring it back to a faster release time.
La vie est reine, n'attendons plus que nous ayons disparu. Sortons des citadelles, tout s'envolera en vain. Adieu à nos querelles.
Okay, now you can tell the vocal is way up front, with a faster release. So this is what the release and attack parameters will do to your signal. Very important to understand. What I'm going to do now is to keep it at around 60 milliseconds. I think this is going to be fast enough for this song. Now let's listen in the context of the music.
La vie est reine, n'attendons plus que nous ayons disparu. Sortons des citadelles, tout.
Okay, now the more I add threshold, the more I bring down my threshold, the more I'm going to need to bring up the makeup gain just to compensate for the loss of volume.
La vie est reine, n'attendons plus que nous ayons disparu. Sortons des citadelles.
Okay, so I think that's pretty good. Now, I'm getting a lot of compression the minute I go into the chorus, okay? And I want to control that. And this is my third trick that I have for you, is to work with pre-gain automation before you go into your compressor, especially with a vocal like this one, where I have a lot of dynamics going on. The chorus is way louder than the verses, so I'm going to fix that up with pre-gain, and I'm going to use clip gain basically, to bring down some sections of the chorus, actually, just to bring that vocal a bit more stable, dynamically speaking, before going into compression. So this way, I'm going to keep my compression more transparent. Okay, so let's try this out. I'm going to go to the chorus.
Que nous ayons disparu.
Okay, starting here, I'm just going to bring that down until I get to the end of the chorus. Just by a couple of dBs. And let's listen to how that sounds like.
Que nous ayons disparu. Sortons des citadelles, tout s'envolera en vain.
Okay, so I'm going to take my time to fine-tune a few things. Bring this part a bit louder, okay?
Que nous ayons disparu. Sortons des citadelles, tout s'envolera en vain. Adieu à nos querelles.
Okay, let's just play around the end part right here, just to bring that a bit louder.
Adieu à nos querelles.
Okay, I think that's good. So now I have something a bit more stable as far as the dynamics goes. I can actually fine-tune even further, but I'm going to keep it as is for now, and the compressor is going to do the rest, okay? But when I mix a vocal, it's going to happen that I'm going to go back and clip gain some stuff while I'm mixing the vocal, and not only at the beginning before adding compression. And this, so you know, is going to affect the signal going into the compressor, okay, like into all the insert chain, basically. Okay, it's not like volume automation. Volume automation is also very useful when mixing, of course, and I'm going to explain to you why later on. But volume automation, which is basically writing up the channels fader, this is going to come after the inserts you have on your channels. Okay, so after your signal has been processed. then you're going to do some volume automation. But pre-gain automation, like I'm doing right now with clip gain, is going to affect the signal going into the inserts. Okay, so just so you know. Now I have a more stable signal going into the compressor, and I can actually tweak that compressor to taste. And this time around, what I'm going to do, instead of using the stock plugin, I'm going to use an 1176, which is going to add a bit more character, I would say, tone to the signal, which I like. And this is a very fast compressor. The attack time is ultra fast. It's a FET compressor, and this is one of the main character of this compressor, is how fast the attack time is. So I'm going to bring that down to 1. Now 1 is going to be the slowest attack time in this case, and it's going to go down on a regular 1176. We're talking about 0.8 milliseconds. So this is very fast, okay? But this is the slowest attack time on an 1176, and it's going to go as fast as, is it like 0.2 microseconds or something like that? Anyways, it's very fast. It's in microseconds, super fast. So I'm going to just play around that attack time and release. I'm going to keep it fast for now. And now I'm going to just use, again, a 4:1 ratio, and we'll see how that goes. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. I'm getting a lot of gain reduction compared to the stock plugin. That's normal. You know, gain reduction is not going to be the same from one compressor to another. Each compressor is going to react differently. On this one, I can actually get a lot of gain reduction and keeping my my compression sound pretty nice and not sounded too over-compressed. And I kind of like the tone that I'm getting with the 1176 also. So this is the type of compression I'm getting with this one. Now for the fourth tip that I have for you is to use more than one compressor. Now I've only been using one compressor, and this time around I'm going to use 2 compressors. So this is my next trick, is to use more than one compressor. Use 2 compressors. Now this time for my first compressor, I'm going to get back with the 1176, but I'm going to focus only on the peaks, okay? I'm going to bring that down and bring my attack time this time to a very fast attack time. Again, what I'm doing here can be done with any compressor of your choice. So let's go with a fast attack on this one and a faster release. The goal here is to just tame down the peaks that I'm getting. So I'm going to go with a super high ratio. I'm actually limiting basically. So let's try this out, and I'm just going to aim for a 1 or 2 dBs of gain reduction on the peaks only. Now I'm pretty much taming down the peaks, so most of the time I'm not getting any gain reduction. So this is basically what this is going to do, and that is its purpose for now. Next, as a second compressor, I'm going to use a tube compressor. Which is going to be a bit more slow as far as the type of compression, a bit like an LA2A, but this time around I'm going to use the Tube STA, same as the 1176. This one is by Arturia, which are great compressors, by the way, so if you want to check them out, I actually made a video reviewing all those compressors by Arturia, which sound great. Okay, I'm going to leave the link on top and down below if you want to watch it. So let's go with this one. Again, going with the fast attack, which is going to turn at around 10 milliseconds or so, and a fast release. And I kind of like the tone of this one. It's going to add a bit more smoothness to the tone of my vocal, which is something that I like a lot. So let's try it out.
Parfois on n'en veut plus, choisissons le plus beau chemin, et avec lui ne faire aucun. La vie est reine, n'attendons plus que nous ayons disparu. Sortons des citadelles,
Okay, now we're going to listen to a before and after, before compression and after compression. So let's start by listening to the uncompressed vocal.
Que nous ayons disparu, sortons des citadelles, tout s'envolera en vain.
Okay, and now with the compressed signal.
Que nous ayons disparu, sortons des citadelles, tout s'envolera en vain.
Now, this is a huge difference. We end up with a way more stable vocal that sits well within the music, okay? Now, the last tip that I have for you, if needed, use dynamic EQ. Dynamic EQ is basically compression on a specific band of frequencies. Let me show you. So in my train, I have a frequency which is a stock EQ plugin out of Cubase, but this one has an option called Dynamics that I have right here. So this is going to activate the compressor on that band of frequencies. And this is a very good tool if you need to tame down one specific band of frequencies that can be aggressive or can just be too much in some part of the song and not always. So cutting out those frequencies is not necessarily the good move to go towards to, but just taming those frequencies down when they are just overloading the mix, using a dynamic EQ is going to serve this purpose well. Okay, so let's say this vocal has a bit too much high-mid frequencies at some point during the chorus. In that case, I would actually use a dynamic EQ and bring down those frequencies. And the rest is going to be the same parameters found on every compressor. So we have the ratio, the attack, release time, and the threshold. So let's try this one out.
Que nous ayons disparu, sortons des citadelles, tout s'envolera en vain. Adieu.
Okay, so that is an example of something that I would do with a dynamic EQ. The mid-range also can be a good band of frequencies to tame down with some dynamic EQ, compressing those bands of frequencies, especially if you have more low mids going on the verses compared to the chorus. This again can be a good tool to work with. You can also use a multiband compressor if you wish to, which is going to be a different approach than a dynamic EQ, but is going to serve the same type of purpose. And also a de-esser. A de-esser is another form of a dynamic EQ. Same type of thing. It's going to compress a specific band of frequencies just to tame down the S's. So I found that using two de-essers works actually very well. One at the beginning, one at the end, keeps the S's under control. Again, if you need to. Now, one last tip, and this one is a bonus one. And this is good, especially if you're new to compression and new to mixing vocals. When compressing, don't be afraid to overdo it. Overcompress so you can hear what compression sounds like. And then back it off a bit until you don't hear that overcompressed effect. And then you're going to be close to the sweet spot where your compression is going to sound the best at. And after I'm done with my vocal sound and I'm happy with the sound that I have, I'm not going to be afraid to add some volume automation by automating the faders channel so the vocal sits better in the mix again if I need to. So those are basically my main vocal compression techniques that I use on a regular basis. So I hope that was helpful. Okay, now let's jump right into today's video and talk about those 3 vocal EQ strategies that I want to share with you. The first one is to take the time to evaluate the vocal sound you're working with. And this is something that a lot of people don't take the time to do. The biggest mistake that someone can do is to just insert an EQ plugin right away and just use a preset or just use your default cutting and boosting values that you're used to make, without evaluating what needs to be done in the context of the mix. And this is very important to take the time to do so. Adding an EQ on a vocal is not a one-size-fits-all. A vocal sound is going to sound different from one singer to another. If you're dealing with a male vocalist, it's going to sound different than a female vocalist. The key of the song also is going to affect the vocal sound. Same for the microphone selection. The distance between the singer and the mic will be a huge factor on the vocal sound. The feel and emotion that the singer will perform with will also be a key factor. And for sure, the style of music is also going to be a huge factor on the vocal sound. If you're working and mixing with a singer-songwriter type of production where you only have to deal with an acoustic guitar and a voice, you're going to EQ that vocal differently than a pop song where you have to deal with, like, I don't know, 50, 60 tracks, in the very dance mix. Now, in this situation, your vocal EQ decisions are going to be different compared to the singer-songwriter production. So that's why it's important to take the time to listen to the vocal sound in the context of the mix. So just pop on your mix, bring on the vocal, ride the vocal throughout the mix, while you're listening to the mix to make sure you have a good balance throughout the mix, and just try to evaluate what needs to be done. And just point out the problems that you're facing while you're listening to that rough mix of the vocal within your actual mix. Now for the second strategy, clean up the vocal. And this is something I do once I'm done evaluating what needs to be done on the vocal. So cleaning up the vocal is the first part. First, I'm going to get rid of the low end of the signal. Everything below 50 hertz is going to go away. I don't need that. It's not even part of the vocal sound. And what ends up in those frequencies are mainly unwanted noise or some rumble sound. That even if we don't hear them much, not taking care of those frequencies can hunt us down later on during the mix, by reducing the amount of dynamic range of a mix. So that's why I just cleaned that up to at least 50 hertz. And that will depend on the vocal and production I'm mixing. Okay, so that can go up to 100 hertz. So between 50 hertz to 100 hertz is going to be my range, and that will go according to the vocal I'm mixing. Then I'm going to focus on 100 to 400 hertz, and this is where the fundamentals of the vocal lives. So it's a very important band of frequencies. This is where you're going to get some intimacy, warmth, proximity effect, but also some mud, so you need to be careful with that region. This is a region where most of the time I'm going to end up with some build-up going on there. And my goal is to hear the fundamentals of the vocal clearly. When that is done, I'm going to end up with some warmth and not mud. Now, by clearing that up, that is going to open the sound and make the full vocal sound way more clear in general. So that will probably make some higher frequencies more present, and maybe you'll be able to notice some sibilance problems. So that's why I'm going to look for that right after. I'm going to look for some sibilance problems that I might have on my vocal sound. And now we're talking about 4K to 9K or something like that, depending if you're mixing a female vocalist or a male vocalist. So when you're getting those S's and T's that are overwhelming that region of frequencies, you need to tame them down by using a de-esser or a dynamic EQ, or you can actually tame them down manually. I made a video on that. I'm going to leave the link right on top and down below if you want to check it out. But this is important to take care of those sibilance. They can be very annoying to listen to. Another area where you can have tiny problems is between 400 and 600 hertz, where you're going to get that boxy sound. Or if you record it in a small room, you can have like room tones build up in that region. But if I have some cleanup to do within these frequencies, I'm always careful. That's because we're dealing with the fulliness of the vocal sound at this point. So if I cut too much, this is not going to help my vocal, and that's for sure. Okay, so I'm always gentle with my cuts when it comes to 400 to 600 hertz. A high Q gentle cut can actually do the trick if you need to remove the boxiness of a sound without affecting the fulliness of the vocal. If you end up with an aggressive vocal sound at some point during the song, let's say the vocalist on the last chorus makes some ad-libs and just, sings his heart out, and you end up with more energy in the upper mid-range, that can create a more aggressive type vocal. And now we're talking about 2.5K to 4K or so, so that can be an area where you can tame that down to get a more smooth vocal sound at some point during the song. Now, if that doesn't happen on all the song, like using a regular EQ cut might not do the trick, but working with a dynamic EQ might help a lot, where you can only focus on compressing only X amount of frequencies when you exceed the amount of threshold. So this is very practical. Now, if you want to know more about dynamic EQ, I think I made a video on that before. I'm going to link it down below. But it's a very practical tool when EQing vocals. And we also have a dynamic EQ part of Frequency 2. That is a stock plugin out of Cubase. And there's also a free plugin available that I'm going to link below if you want to check it out and you don't have Cubase 11. The 1K to 2.5K is a frequency range that is very sensitive to humans. And that's the thing with us humans, you know, we know how a vocal should sound like because we interact with other people all day long. So we know how a vocal sound like. So from 1 to around 2.5K, this is where we're gonna, us as humans, hear a vocal sound the most. So that's why I'm very gentle with that frequency region, you know. So I try not to cut too much or to boost too much in that region. So most of the time, I'm gonna leave that alone. But again, it's a case-by-case thing, you know. So if I end up, for example, with a more telephonic type vocal for some reason, maybe I'm going to bring down the 1 to 1.5K region so I can have a more balanced sound. But if I cut too much, I'm going to end up with a more hollow sound. And that doesn't sound very natural for us humans. So we need to be careful with that area. And if I'm dealing with the nasal vocal sound, I'm going to check what's happening between 800K and 1.5 kilohertz. Now that I'm done cleaning up the vocals with subtractive EQ, I'm going to check if I need to enhance the vocal sound with some EQ boost. Now, if I need to add a bit of brightness to my vocal sound, between 5 and 6K is a good way to start. But be careful because that can also enhance some sibilance. So it's always a matter of balance. But sometimes what I also do is to add some air to my vocal sound. And now I'm talking about super high frequencies, like 16K and above. And for that, I love to use a vintage type EQ, which is going to give me a bit more color and character, and which will sound a bit more musical compared to a surgical type EQ like Frequency or the FabFilter Pro Q3. Now, I'm going to go more towards a Pultec type EQ, which is going to work well by boosting 16K and above. And that is also going to bring some brightness to my sound without activating sibilance, you know. So that is something that you can experiment with also. Sometimes I'm going to end up with a very smooth vocal sound with not a lot of mid-range. And that could be due to the tone of the microphone that was used during the recording. In that case, a boost at around 1 to 2K is going to be very useful, and that will bring a bit more presence and will bring the vocal a bit more up front. So again, it depends on what you have to deal with, and that can also be useful in a very dense mix where there's a lot going on. So if you just need to bring that vocal a bit more up front, you can check between 1 and 2K. But again, too much of that range is going to make your vocal sound a bit more telephonic. And you know what? If I'm dealing with a thin vocal, I'm not going to be afraid to go and boost a bit of 100 Hertz or 150. That can actually do the job pretty well. So if we look back at the 3 vocal EQ strategies, we have evaluating the vocal sound, clean up the vocal sound, and enhance the vocal sound. So those are my 3 vocal EQ strategies. I hope that was helpful. If so, share and like this video. Now let's start this one up. I'm going to start with the first trick that I want to share with you today, and this one is to use a slapback delay. So I'm going to show you what that is all about. The slapback delay is essentially a short delay, and a short delay is going to add some fullness, some density, and some space around the vocal. And I love to use a stereo delay to work with a slapback delay. So I'm going to jump in Cubase, put on my headphones, and I'm gonna just use the stock plugin out of Cubase, the stereo delay, so anyone can use that from your own DAW. And I'm actually having this delay on an effects channel track, so as a send effect. So it's not inserted on the vocal channel, but it's inserted on the effects channel track, and I'm sending the signal from my vocal channel to the effects channel track. This way it gives me way more flexibility, and that's like for 90% of the time I'm going to work this way when it comes to delays and reverbs. All right, so now I'm going to open this stereo delay, and the idea is to create a super short delay without any repeats, only like one repeat max, okay? So that's why the feedback is way down to 0%. If you increase the amount of feedback, that will increase the amount of repeats. And I don't want that in this case. I'm going to use that later on, but not for a slapback delay. I just want to get that initial repeat, and that's it. And that was going to be enough to create a very nice space around the vocal and bring my vocal a bit more dense. So what I'm doing now in this case is to, like, instead of using the sync option, which is going to sync to the tempo of my project, I'm just going to use the milliseconds as far as the delay time goes. And as a starting point, I'm going to start at 125 milliseconds. Usually that will depend on the tempo of the song I'm mixing, but I can start up depending on if it's a high tempo song or a low tempo song. I can start at 80 milliseconds and up to 200 milliseconds and even 225 milliseconds if I want to. So that will depend on the song I'm mixing. Like in general, lower milliseconds will work better on faster songs and higher milliseconds on slower songs. But that is only, again, a starting point. All right, so let's start this one with these parameters. So on one side, the left side, I have 125 milliseconds, and on the right side, delay 2, I have 175 milliseconds. The reason why I'm doing so is to create a difference between those two sides so I can end up with a stereo effect, or else it's just going to cancel itself. If I bring both delays to the same millisecond value, it's going to cancel itself out and it's going to sound mono, and this is not what I want to do in this case. And then my panning goes to the far left for delay 1 and to the far right for delay 2. So let's have a quick listen.
Trouvé par la rose et je fuis vers l'infiniment petit.
Again, it's a matter of balance.
Le regard tourné vers lui, mon firmament il brille d'un amour extravagant, d'une couleur sans un temps, me poussant dans l'infini de cet instant. Trouvé par la rose et je fuis vers l'infiniment petit, le regard tourné vers lui.
Okay, so you get the idea. You can hear that the vocal, when I add the slapback delay, will sound a bit more dense. And that's the goal of using a slapback delay, to add a bit more density, more space around the vocal, and that works pretty well. And again, it's a matter of balance. In some type of productions, you want to hear a bit more of that slapback delay. In other productions, you want to bring it down and make it a bit more just like to feel that you're in the space more than hearing the delay itself. Now, I just want to try something out here. I want to increase. I'm going to add a bit more milliseconds here just to try it out. So 175 on one side and 225 on the other. So we'll listen if that one sounds better for this song. Let me bring that down to 150 and maybe 200 on this one. Now, by using a stereo delay, if you hear that your slapback delay sounds a bit too wide, you can actually narrow down the panning of that delay by bringing down that knob, the pan knob, from the left and also from the right. You can also use a mono delay if you want. That actually can sound very good. So I'm going to bring my feedback down to 0. And a good starting point as time delay goes, 1/16 of a note can do the job pretty well. Which in milliseconds is going to go at around roughly 180 milliseconds. And the same idea, you can just tweak that around to your own taste. So this is the Slapback Delay. Try it out, let me know how it goes. Now for the second trick is to use a 1/8 of a note delay to fill up the gaps of the vocals. Okay, so let's try this one out. And this goes on another effects channel that is right beside my slap delay channel. And I'm going to use the same plugin, the stereo delay from Cubase. And this time around, I'm going to set that one up to sync. So it is synced to the tempo of the mix I'm working on. And I'm going to set that up to 1/8 of a note. And that will actually add a longer delay than the slap delay that we used earlier. And I'm going to add, in this case, more feedback. So instead of having the feedback to 0, I'm going to bring that one up so I can create more repeats, because I want to fill up the gaps, when there's pauses in the melody, on the vocal. I want to make sure that I get a bit more repeats just to fill up those empty gaps. Okay, so let me check this out with 40% for the feedback. Again, very important, by the way, to bring the mix knob to 100% wet, because we are using this plugin in parallel. So it's on an effects channel track, so that wet and dry needs to be at 100%. That also goes for the slapback delay that we used earlier, and also for any types of delays or reverbs. Okay, so keep that in mind. And again, the panning will go to the far left and the far right on delay 1 and 2. And this is what I'm going to end up with. So, the way it's set up right now, 1/8 of a note on each side, same parameters. As you can tell, it sounds mono, so everything is in the center. That might work for you, so if it does, you're good to go. But in my case, I want to just keep having that stereo image a bit more wider. So I'm going to do something pretty cool on this delay. Since I'm limited with the amount of options, I'm going to unsync one of the delays. And I'm going to calculate how much is 1/8 of a note out of my tempo, which is 83 BPM. In my case, since I know that 361 milliseconds is 1/8 of a note, roughly, I just brought that down to 350 milliseconds on one side, and I kept the 1/8 of a note on the second one, and this is how it sounds like.
Par la rose et je fuis
Instead of this.
vers l'infiniment petit, le regard tourné vers lui, mon firmament il
sounds way more stereo. I can, hear that the repeats are surrounding my vocals. So now let's listen to this effect in the context of the mix. So again, it's a matter of balance, and the trick is to make sure you hear those repeats, in a subtle way, just to fill up those empty spaces from the vocal line without being too much and too present. And that's the danger with delays. You can end up adding way too much. So in my case, like in this situation, anyways, I want to keep it subtle. Maybe on some other mixes and other situations, I would like to have them a bit more present, but in this case I'm just going to keep it a bit more subtle. The ping pong delay is also a nice option to be used on a vocal. Compared to the stereo delay will apply delay on each side, the left and the right, at the same time. The ping pong delay will bounce from left to right. Okay, so the delay, the right side delay and the left side delay will not play at the same time. So let's have a listen. So that can create a very cool rhythmic stereo effect. But if that is a bit too wide, you can bring down the spatial knob here, which is going to reduce the image of that delay. Now for the third trick, EQ your delay. So this is something, honestly, that helps a lot. And let's go back to our slapback delay. And there's an EQ straight on the plugin itself. You can also use an EQ plugin and add that after the delay or even before the delay. I'm going to show that to you right after. But, most of the time, if I have some EQ parameters straight on the delay, it's going to be faster to reach out to those parameters than adding an extra plugin. But that depends on what you want to achieve. But let's go and use those filters. I'm going to filter out the top end and the bottom end of that delay to around 300 hertz and bring, cutting up the top down to 5.4 kilohertz. And same for the second side. Numbers are not matching, which I don't care much. It doesn't matter. But the goal here is to clean up the low-end frequencies, like the muddiness that I can get below 300 hertz. I don't want that surrounding my vocal, okay? So that's why I'm cleaning that up. And same for the top end, by bringing that top end down out of the delay plugin, it's going to make the delay sound a bit more transparent, okay? And not that audible, which is going to sound pretty good. So let's check it out with the Slapback Delay.
Et je fuis vers l'infiniment petit. Le regard tourné.
Okay, I'm going to turn off the filters.
Trouvé par la rose et je fuis vers l'infiniment petit. Le regard tourné vers lui.
Okay, so
firmament.
They sound like the delay sound a bit more darker, which sounds more transparent and sits down way better in the mix. All right, so now let's check and do the same with the stereo delay.
Trouvé par la rose et je fuis. Trouvé par la rose et je fuis.
Sounds more darker, less muddy. So, again, more transparent. And that sounds better, in my opinion, in the context of the mix. And now for tip number 4, add a reverb on your delay. Now, this is not something that I do all the time. However, it does happen that, especially if I'm not using an actual reverb for the vocals, but only a delay, adding a reverb after the delay is actually pretty nice. So let me check this out on the Slapback Delay. So I'm going to bypass my frequency EQ because I don't want to use those on this mix. And the stereo delay is right here. And I'm going to add a plate reverb right after my stereo delay. So I'm going to solo the vocal and let's have a quick listen.
Trouvé par la rose et je fuis vers l'infiniment petit. Le regard tourné.
Okay, so now what I'm doing here, I'm not using a long reverb, so it's not a super short one as well, but something that fits well with the tempo of the song. And the trick is to blend it to taste, okay, to make sure that you have the perfect balance between the dry and the wet signal. And so in this case, the blend parameter here is gonna help a lot, and that will determine how much reverb you want to get on your delay.
Trouvé par la rose et je fuis vers l'infiniment petit.
That's pretty cool.
Le regard tourné vers lui. Mon firmament, il brille d'un amour extravagant, d'une couleur sans entend, me poussant dans l'infini de cet instant. Trouvé par la rose et je fuis vers.
So that's pretty cool. So I kind of like how that sounds like. It's just going to add a bit more space around, that slapback delay, which is quite nice. I'm going to try the same on the stereo delay, the 1/8 of a note delay.
Trouvé par la rose et je fuis vers l'infiniment petit. Le regard tourné vers lui. Mon firmament, il brille.
Okay, if I blend that in the context of the mix and also with the slapback delay. number 5 is to use vocal throws, and this is something very cool to work with. I actually made a video on vocal throws if you want to watch it, because there's several ways you can set that up in Cubase. I'm going to leave the link on top and down below. So for the vocal throws, I'm using the Echo Boy, and this one is set up to 1/4 of a note, so it's a longer delay with a lot of feedback. But what I'm doing is that I am automating the delay when the delay comes in and comes out, because I'm only adding that delay on specific lines, okay, of the vocal. And this is how it looks like straight from the project window. And I'm automating the send level going into that delay channel. Those are the automation that I have, and this is how it sounds like. All right, let's solo the lead vocal.
Trouvé par la rose et je fuis vers l'infiniment petit. Le regard tourné vers lui, mon firmament il brille.
So vocal throws will be used for stylist type effects. So this is why I always use automation when working with throws, because you just want to focus on like some specific words or just one specific word out of a vocal line to emphasize on that word and make it repeat, which adds a very nice effect and a very good emotion also. Now I'm going to share with you one last tip, okay? So I'm going to go to tip number 6. Okay, and this one is about using different tones and delay styles. Okay, I'm going to show that to you right away. And actually, if we stick to our delay throw channel, if I look at the Echo Boy that I'm using, I'm actually adding a lot of low cut to the signal and also a lot of high cut to the signal. So I actually end up with a kind of a radio type tone. And I'm also using a DM2 style. And this is the cool thing about the Echo Boy delay, which is one of my favorite delays. It has different styles, like the DM2 is what I'm using. There's also a master tape, a studio tape, and so on, you know. So this is why I ended up with this different type of tone for that delay. So let's just listen to it briefly.
Vers l'infiniment petit, le regard tourné
Okay, now let's try it out on the stereo delay this time, and I'm going to use the Echo Boy, solo the vocal.
vers l'infiniment petit, le regard tourné vers lui, mon firmament il.
Okay, so that is, you know, a similar effect that I had with the stereo delay. 1/8 of a note, a bit of feedback, and now I'm going to add a bit more low cut and a bit of high cut filters. And there's the offset, and that is the option that I have on Echo Boy to just to make the right side and left side different. So it's going to just offset the left and right with this parameter. So instead of changing the values manually, I can just turn up that knob and keep my my delay mode to single echo.
Vers l'infiniment petit, le regard tourné vers lui, mon firmament.
All right, so what I'm going to do here is instead of using a digital delay sound, which is the one we are hearing right now, I'm going to try the DM2.
Vers l'infiniment petit, le regard tourné vers lui.
Sounds way more darker. Let's go with space echo.
Vers l'infiniment petit, le regard tourné vers lui.
That's interesting. Echo flex.
Vers l'infiniment petit, le regard tourné vers lui.
So that's pretty cool, and I can even add some saturation if I want to.
Vers l'infiniment petit, le regard tourné vers lui, mon firmament.
All right, so let's blend that in the context of the mix. that's pretty cool. That sounds actually pretty good. So what I like about using delay styles like this one is just to add a bit more color to the delay, a bit more character also, and it also blends well in the mix and makes that delay more transparent, colorful also, and you can even end up adding a bit more delay without being too distractive, you know. And this is something that I like to do. But sometimes a digital delay that is pretty clean is going to work well. But a lot of times I'm going to reach out for a different style of delay or just EQ the delay itself, adding saturation myself with the use of another plugin. So it depends on with which plugin I'm working with. If you don't have a plugin like the Echo Boy and the only delay you work with is a stock plugin delay, you can just mess around with EQ, saturation on the effects channel track and create your own delay tone, and that will work as well. So there you go, my friend. Those are my top 5 vocal delay tricks that you can use in your mixes. Again, you don't need to use them all at once, but it gives you different possibilities to work with on your next mix. Mixing vocals, and this time around, vocal saturation. Now this is going to be the last video of a quick series I've made on mixing vocals here on YouTube. The first one was published back in October with 5 vocal delay tips. If you want to watch that video and all the other videos part of that series, I'm going to leave a link down below so you can watch the full YouTube playlist. There's one, like I said, on delays, one on vocal reverb, vocal EQ, vocal compression, and this one is the last of the series, and it has to do with vocal saturation, which is an important aspect on mixing vocals, something that I use all the time, and I'm going to show you what I do on my side when it comes to work with saturation while mixing vocals. So let's jump in Cubase and start this one up. Now for the first tip, add warmth and color to your vocal using saturation. All right, so in Cubase, let's have a quick listen to the song we are going to work on today. So this is a song that I co-wrote with a good friend of mine, the lead singer of this song, Anne-Clémence Rouffet. We actually released that single a few months ago. So again, I'm going to leave all the infos down below if you want to listen to the full song. Now, what I'm going to do here, I'm going to solo that lead vocal for the verse. Let me remove the effects like the reverbs and delays. I'm going to try to keep this one as dry as possible. There's a bit of compression and EQ going on. So something I like to do is to use a console emulation plugin or a preamp type plugin like the Arturia pre-1973, just to give a bit more fullness to the sound by adding some natural harmonics created by saturation. Now, if you don't know a lot about saturation or you're a bit confused about how saturation is created, you can actually watch my full video talking about saturation that I'm going to leave down below. Now, the reason why I like to use these types of plugins like a preamp plugin or a console emulation plugin is to get that natural type of analog vibe that we get when recording through those devices. You know, when you actually record in a preamp or in an analog console. Now, for a lot of people, using the interfaces preamp is the option you have to work with, which is going to produce a very clean and transparent recording, which is fine. But at some point, it's actually very nice to add a bit more fullness to a very clean and transparent sound. And this is why I like to use these types of plugin. So let's try it out with the pre-1973, where I can actually increase the input gain level of the preamp. To create more saturation. So more signal is going to go through the transformers of the preamp itself, which is going to produce saturation, which will create harmonics. And the goal here is not to distort the signal. It's just to add a subtle amount of saturation, just to create a bit more fullness by getting more harmonics out of the sound. Okay, so let's check it out here. If I increase it to the max,
entouré de l'infini.
Now I'm getting a lot of saturation.
Ma main dans la sienne.
This is not what I'm looking for.
Rien que maintenant
I think that's
je
going to
vis
be good enough.
une poussière de vie éclatante de sourire, m'amenant dans le.
Okay, that's pretty cool. So that is one way you can add a bit more fullness to your sound and make your clean and transparent signal sound a bit more exciting. I can also use tape emulation, so let's bypass the preamp for now and go with the Kramer Master Tape by Waves, which is a very good tape emulation plugin. Let's try this one out.
Poussé par la pensée d'une nuit, entouré de l'infini, ma main dans la sienne ainsi, rien que maintenant je
If I increase the record
une
level,
poussière de vie,
now I'm increasing the amount of signal going to the tape, and that creates also saturation. Now, the saturation I get from a tape emulation plugin is going to be a bit more warm and more dark in a way. And that's because of the roll-off that I get on the top end of the signal that is produced by tape saturation. All right, let's add the preamp on top of that and listen to what we have.
Poussé par la pensée d'une nuit, entouré de l'infini, ma main dans la sienne ainsi, rien que maintenant je vis une poussière de vie éclatante de sourire.
So this is a very good way to add warmth, analog color, and fullness to your vocal sound. As far as the order in the chain, where I put those plugins, like if I use a preamp plugin, I'm going to use that straight on top, or a console emulation plugin. I'm going to tend to use it as one of the first plugins in the chain. And as far as the tape goes, that could actually follow the preamp emulation plugin, or I can also bring that at the end of the chain. And that also works pretty well. So it depends on what I'm mixing. So it's just a matter of experimenting and see what works best for you. Now for the second tip, use saturation in parallel. Now this is very useful if you want to add like high level saturation, but blended with the dry signal. That actually works pretty well. So I'm gonna add on this one the Arturia Dist Op Amp 21, which is an emulation of the Sans Amp, and I just made a copy of my vocal track, and this is my parallel channel that I'm going to be using. So if I just blend that with the unsaturated vocal, this is what I get.
Poussé par la pensée d'une nuit, entouré de l'infini.
Okay, on its own, this is how that saturation or distortion at this point sounds like.
Poussé par la pensée d'une nuit, entouré de l'infini, ma main dans la sienne ainsi, rien que maintenant je vis une poussière de vie éclatante de sourire.
So it adds a bit more edge and character to that sound. You can hear that saturation, but you can actually blend it so you actually don't hear it, but you feel it more than anything else. And that, again, can add more, like I said, more character, more edginess to the sound. Getting that sound a bit more upfront also, this is going to help a lot. So using saturation, like heavy saturation in parallel, to the vocal is a great way to do it also. It's not something I do all the time, but it's something that is very useful when I need to. Now for tip number 3, filter out the signal before saturation. This is also something that is going to help to get the best out of your saturation, especially if you work with heavy saturation on your track or in parallel like I'm doing right now. So something I can do is to filter out the signal going into the saturation. So in this case, what I'm going to do here is to add a high-pass filter, tame down the low mids, and add the boost on the top end, and we'll see how that goes.
Poussé par la pensée d'une nuit, entouré de l'infini, ma main dans la sienne ainsi.
Now that's nice because I'm getting rid of all that mud that was feeding the saturation. Something else I can also do if I'm dealing with a lot of sibilance, I can add a de-esser prior to the saturation. So this way I'm not feeding my saturation with some sibilance. I'm going to get more control over the sound before it ends in saturation.
Poussé par la pensée d'une nuit, entouré de l'infini, ma main dans la sienne ainsi, rien que maintenant je vis une poussière de vie, éclatante de sourire.
So that actually works pretty well. Something else you can do with filtering and EQ before getting into saturation is to emphasize on specific frequencies. If you want to saturate, a specific band of frequencies, whether it's the mid-range or the high mids or whatever you want to emphasize, you can boost those frequencies. So those frequencies get saturated more than anything else. So that is also something that can be done if this is what you're looking for. But what I like to do on my end is to get rid of the mud, add a de-esser, and there you go. Now, the cool thing with this is that I actually shaped the tone of the saturation. And while I'm balancing that out with the unsaturated vocal track, I'm actually changing the overall tone also, which is going to make my vocal a bit more brighter, a bit more upfront, which works well for parallel processing. And this is a way to EQ your vocal and change the tone of your vocals without adding EQ, but by using saturation. Now for the next tip, multiband saturation. This can be useful. So let's bring that down, my parallel saturation down. And I'm going to open at the end of my chain the Quadraphase plugin by Steinberg. That is a stock Cubase plugin. That actually works pretty well. So this is the multiband saturation plugins, meaning that you can add saturation on different bands of frequencies and deactivate saturation on some other bands if you want to, or different types of saturation depending on the bands you're working on, so which can be very useful. So on my side, what I have here, let's go and focus on the mid-range by adding a bit of tube saturation on the channel itself. So it's not in parallel, but straight on the channel. So let's have a listen.
C'est par la pensée d'une nuit, entouré
Let's
de
bypass
l'infini,
the reverbs and
ma
stuff.
main dans la sienne ainsi, rien que maintenant je vis une poussière de vie, éclatante de sourire, m'amenant dans le moment.
That again is a way to tone shape your sound without the use of an EQ. Just by adding some saturation, which is going to create some harmonics to the sound. Now, I'm only focusing on frequencies between, let me check here, between 1.5 kilohertz to 10K. So those are the frequencies that are getting worked out by the saturation plugin.
C'est par la pensée d'une nuit, entouré de l'infini, ma main dans la sienne ainsi, rien que maintenant je vis une poussière de vie.
So using a multiband saturation plugin is a very good way to tone shape your sound with saturation by just focusing on specific bands of frequencies. Now for tip number 5, use saturation on effects like delays and reverbs. Okay, so what I have here, I have a vocal throw channel right here, where I have the Echo Boy as a delay. And I'm going to use this channel just to add some delay on some specific words. Something that can be done, and this can be done on any type of delays, and you can also experiment using the same type of approach with reverbs also. But on this video, I'm mainly going to use it on a delay which works very well. So for this one, I'm using the Echo Boy delay by Soundtoys, which is one of my favorite delay plugins. I've been working with this one for years. It has served me well so far. So I have on this plugin the saturation knob, which is going to add some saturation to the delay signal, which is very cool to work with. So let's have a quick listen by just soloing the delay only. Okay, so if I add some saturation, there you go. That is pretty cool. That's very nice. Now this is a ping pong delay going from left to right. Let's blend that with the actual vocal. That's pretty cool. So it actually adds a lot to that vocal delay. Now I might overdid it for the sake of this video, but that gives you an idea. Now if you don't have a saturation knob on your delay, you can just add a saturation plugin after the delay on your effects channel track and blend that out, you know, and that will work perfectly. You can add this on a slapback delay if you want to, on any types of delay that you have on your vocal. So I love using a bit of saturation on my vocal delays just to get them to sound different, to stand out a bit more. Now, before I wrap this one up, let me give you one extra tip. So tip number 6, as a bonus tip, add the saturation on back vocals. So what I have here on my end is doubles, okay, where I recorded the lead vocal on the verses 2 extra times separately, so I can create a more wide vocal sound. So I'm panning one of the doubles left and the other one right, and I just blend that with the lead vocal, so I'm getting like a wider vocal sound. So if I solo my double channel, which are grouped into a group channel, I'm getting this. Okay, so I have like a de-esser, an EQ, a bit of compression, and if I add this plugin, which is the Tape Melo-Fi by Arturia, which is based on the Mellotron, I'm getting some preamp and tape saturation, which adds a lot of tone to the signal. So let's have a listen. That's pretty cool. So a bit of preamp drive with some tape saturation also. I'm getting a lot of focus on the mid-range, especially low mids a bit, you know, which works great for this part. And it blends pretty well with the lead vocal also. So let's blend this up with the lead vocal. Okay, let's listen to the vocal in solo.
Poussé par la pensée d'une nuit, entouré de l'infini, ma main dans la sienne ainsi, rien que maintenant je vis une poussière de vie.
So there you go, my friends. This is what you can do with vocal saturation. There's a lot of options here, a lot of tips that I shared with you. Now, there's way more stuff you can do with saturation and vocal, and also on other instruments, of course. So basically what saturation is going to do to the signal is going to create some harmonics and also some light and natural compression to your sound. And that gives you a lot of leverage when mixing vocals and also other instruments. All right, so now let's jump in Cubase and check what we have. Now, the first tip I have for you is to use an expander instead of a gate on a lead vocal. So I'm going to open my gate plugin, which is the C1 gate from Waves. You can use any gate out of your DAW. Most of them will have a gate and also the option of an expander. So I'm going to explain to you what the difference is between the two. Now, the gate is very simple to understand. Everything below a certain threshold point is going to be cut off. The door is going to close, or the gate is going to close. Okay, so that is the idea of a gate. And an expander, if I activate the expander, it's very similar and close to what a gate does, but instead of fully removing the audio below a threshold point, it's going to turn it down. Okay, so it's going to sound smoother on a vocal. So I'm going to have you listen to the difference between the gate and the expander. So I'm going to solo my vocal track right here.
Trouvé par la rosée, je fuis.
And I'm going to play around with the amount of threshold of the gate.
Le regard tourné vers lui, mon firmament il brille d'un amour extravagant.
Okay, now I'm doing it to the extreme so you can actually hear what a gate is going to do if my threshold point is higher. So everything below that point is going to be cut off. Now, if I activate the expander instead, this is how it's going to sound like. Same parameters.
Trouvé par la rosée, je fuis vers l'infiniment peu.
Now, even if I'm not at the threshold sweet spot level, I can hear that the sound is smoother. Okay, so I'm going to find my sweet spot here.
Trouvé par la rosée, je fuis vers l'infiniment petit.
What I like about using an expander instead of a gate is that I can keep all those like natural noises like breaths, okay, but in a very gentle way, so just by reducing the volume of those type of noise. So by using an expander instead of a gate, I get to keep those noises but at a lower level. So let's do the same with the gate.
Trouvé par la rosée, je fuis vers l'infiniment petit.
So, you know, this is, again, why I don't like to use a gate, especially on the lead vocal. It's going to get rid of everything below that threshold point, and in this case, I'm actually losing all the breaths. Sometimes breaths can be annoying, can be distracting, can be too much when they are too loud. And using a gate, yes, will get rid of those breaths, but if you remove too much, in my opinion anyways, it's going to remove the natural sound of the vocal also. Now, in some situations, the use of a gate is going to work very well. So in that case, what I do is I pay attention to the release time of the gate. So the more you increase the release time, the more time it's going to take for the gate to close. And this will result in the more smoother sound without hearing some cuts at the end of each line.
Poussé par la pensée d'une nuit, entouré de l'infini, ma main dans la sienne ainsi, rien que maintenant je vis.
Another vocal gate pro tip is to do it manually. Yes, you heard me. Do it without the use of any plugin. And this is very useful if you want to get rid of unwanted noise. Like, for example, the singer hit the microphone stand while recording between two vocal lines and you want to get rid of that noise. You can do that manually. Or just to clean up your vocal recording. You know, like if I don't have anything going on in the chorus for one vocal track, I'm simply going to clean that up and remove those empty spaces. And even to tame down vocal breaths, which I'm going to do a case-by-case approach.
Trouvé par la rosée, je fuis vers l'infiniment.
These are not too bad and they will not be distractive on the long run. But if I go towards the end of that verse,
Me poussant dans l'infini de cet instant.
now these are a bit too loud in my opinion, so I'm going to tame them down. I'm just going to select my selection tool and just click on Shift X to split that into its own event and bring that one down.
Me poussant dans
Okay,
l'infini.
now it sounds way smoother. But, you know, doing all those steps can actually be long. At some point, everything adds up. So I actually created myself a key command with a bunch of different commands in Cubase to make this process faster. So I'm going to select this breath here and from my controller, I'm going to activate that key command. Now, if you want to look for this key command, I'm going to list it right in the video description below. So check it out and you can create your own. Assign this key command to a keyboard shortcut or straight on a controller like I did on my end. And this way it's going to be super fast to bring down one specific part of a recording like I just did right here.
de cet instant.
There you go. Now it sounds way more smoother. And this manual approach is usually what I'm going to reach for, especially when I have a clean vocal recording. Now, if you're dealing with a noisy vocal recording where you have like a tiny background noise going on, maybe using an expander in that case as a plug-in insert is going to work well, But for the most part, this is how I do it on my side in a manual way. Now, if you're working with a vocal that has a bit of a noise into the recording, or that you can hear the natural reverb of the room the vocal was recorded into. That happens, especially if the room doesn't have a lot of acoustic treatment. In that case, working with a gate or an expander is going to work very well to get rid of that room sound that you have on that vocal recording. Now, my next vocal gate tip is to remove breaths and noise on back vocals. And this is something that I do because I don't want to end up, especially with breaths, I don't want to end up with breaths bouncing left and right, especially if my back vocals are stacked vocals, doubling the lead vocal, like I have right here. So let me have you listen to those vocals with the lead.
Mon firmament, il brille d'un amour extravagant.
Okay, so now what I did here is I removed all the breaths out of the double back vocals. And I did that on purpose, again, not to be stuck with some unwanted noise and breaths between lines, bouncing left and right, because those vocals are panned left and right. So I only going to keep the breaths in a very gentle way, only on the lead vocal. So this way, everything is well controlled and I keep the natural sound of the vocal. So I'm going to show you something here. I'm just going to get rid of these edits and start that over. So again, you can simply clean that up manually. You can use a gate also on those vocals. That can be done. But if you work in Cubase, there's a nice feature here that you can use. I'm going to select my lead vocal double and I'm going to go right on top under audio, go down to advanced and click on detect silence. And this is actually very well done. So this will detect all the silence out of this selection. So I have the open threshold and close threshold linked together. This is the way I do it if I have to use this feature. And I just bring that down to the amount of threshold that I need just to get rid of the silence, like I can see right here on the visual part of this window. The minimum time open, I leave that at 0 milliseconds, and minimum time closed, I set that up to 30 milliseconds, and that works pretty well. Pre-roll and post-roll, important to add some, or else your vocal sound is going to be cut off too soon. Okay, so this is going to help to keep the tail of the vocal sound intact. So I keep that at 150 milliseconds, around that level is good. And then I have the amount of selections detected. And this is what's going to happen when I'm going to click on process. There you go. I have no more breaths or, all the silence part of that selected event are gone, basically. Important in that case, though, is to just add some fades, okay? Just gentle fades to smooth everything up and you're good to go. So if you work in Cubase, this is actually a very fast way to remove silence out of a vocal recording. But again, I'm going to use this type of approach mainly on stacked back vocals. I hope those tips were helpful. If so, share, like, subscribe to the channel if you're new here. There you go, my friend. I hope you enjoyed this complete guide to mix vocals like a pro. Don't forget to download the free mixing guides. The link is down below. And also to share, like, and subscribe to this channel if you're not already. Until next time, take care and see you.